Hello, and welcome to What's Literacy by Literacy Quebec. What's Literacy is a community-based podcast for English-speaking lifelong literacy learners. My name is Dan Laxer. I'm a journalist with nearly 30 years' experience in broadcast media. I'm a writer at the Suburban newspaper, and I'm the host of this podcast where we explore topics around community building, lifelong curiosity, and the multiple types of literacy. My guest this episode is Alix Adrien. Alix is a lifelong educator and president of the board of directors of the Quebec Board of Black Educators, the QBBE. Alix, welcome to What's Literacy.
You're welcome for having me.
It's a pleasure. Why don't we start off? Tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would. I know that you're technically supposed to be retired, but are you?
Technically, people laugh when I say that I'm retired. I retired, I guess, from active duty, so to speak, the professional as a career. I was a lifelong teacher, then an administrator, and I did retire in 2013. But I'm a lifelong educator, and I come from a family of educators, and I believe that there's a lot to do in spite of if it's not in what we would call a formal setting. There's a lot much more that can be done as well in informal settings. So, as a president of the Quebec Board of Black Educators, a community organization which works in partnership with school boards, I continue my mission to empower children to sort of to seek the impossible when they felt that they could learn or attend certain a level in their education. Well, we work hard with them and we build their self-esteem first, which I think is key before then we get to learning. And then we've been successful, but it's a full-time job.
You've answered so many questions that I had in one fell swoop, so we'll get into a broader discussion. And of course, I do want to point out that we missed Black History Month by a couple of weeks, but we can talk about Black issues outside of February, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I,
Um,
I've al- I've always my position is that we take the month to celebrate the beginning of another season, another full year of new events.
yeah,
So
well
it's
said.
happening through.
I want to get into what you were talking about. I wanted to ask you what drew you to teaching, what made you want to be a teacher. But as you said, you come from a long line of educators. Tell me a little more about that.
You know, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, I might have given you another answer. But in retrospect, and as I got to speak to, I come from a very large family on my father's side, more so than in my mother's side. But and my father was one of the older brothers, and I got to get acquainted to some of my uncles and know a little bit more about the sort of the family DNA, and I realized it wasn't by chance that I'm doing what I do because they all pretty much do the same. We are very much involved in community building. We strongly believe that to lay the foundation for people to be successful, that we work at the grassroots. My uncles are very much part of the Rotary Club International. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They
Mhm.
do a lot of good things. So as I got to speak to them, I realized ultimately I couldn't help myself. I had to do this because that's one of the main drivers of the family.
When did you become a teacher?
I became a teacher in 1987, but I have to tell you, my dad was also a physics and math teacher. And back home in Haiti, he had founded a school, a college, Collège José Marti, and another school called La Jardinière. So the family evolves in education where, my father used to teach his younger brothers, so to speak, and I realized like most of them are all either physics teachers or math teachers. As a matter of fact, one of my uncle, who was mayor of Mont-Laurier for 3 years, and when I spoke to him recently and I asked him, so what did you do? He goes, oh, I teach physics and math. And I said, here I am thinking he taught history or something.
That's
So
fascinating how, not just the love of teaching, but the subject matter kind of
yeah,
came down through the generations.
yeah,
Uh, what was life like? How old would you have been when your father founded a school?
I wasn't born.
Oh, wow.
My
Okay.
father founded the school apparently the first for my oldest brother, who was at least 4 years older than me.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't born because a lot of those that attended my father's schools over the years would refer to me, would say that, oh, we remember you used to run around the schoolyard with your diapers on. So
So that That's going to lead to another part of the discussion that I wanted to get into. What was life like in Haiti at the time that he felt that he needed to found a school? And what was it? What did it fall outside of other schools in Haiti at the time, the school, the
Oh,
education system?
Dad felt very strongly that quality education should not only be for those that can afford it, right? He was back then, I guess, a teacher was pretty much a a professional who would work at different schools. I know my dad taught at a Université de Port-au-Prince in l'École de Médecine. And so he would teach in different schools and colleges. And overall, what drove him is exactly that. He felt that only people that seems to have the means to have a good education were able to. And
Mm,
so he felt that uh, uh, to build a society, especially back in Haiti, that where there was a high rate of illiteracy, quality education was important for him. And that's what he started. He introduced me to that concept as a little man. I used to remember seeing people waiting for him at home, and I used to ask him, "Well, who are you waiting for?" So he goes, "We're waiting for your father." And I said, "Well, why?" He goes, "So that well, he can help us in trying to get our high school completed." So I was exposed to it very early.
So what in your at least in the early days, I'm so fascinated by maybe how you might have changed as a person and as an educator from the time you started teaching to the time you retired.
Well, you see, there's like you said, what drove me to teaching. In retrospect, as a young man, I've always had summer jobs working in day camps. So
Mm,
you could see the pattern of sort of that community building and community activism. And I also played a lot of basketball, and I love the fact that as a coach, as a teacher, I was able to coach as well. So I was not only teaching physics and math and the sciences, but I was also coaching young men, especially a lot of them who didn't have a father in their lives. And I've took real gratitude in helping young men become men by instilling certain values in them. So I felt it was I always looked at mentoring as the second phase of education. You work with instructing a concept, but it's also a great vehicle to teach values and to instill in them work ethics that hopefully can drive into success.
and I wonder if it also helps you to develop a rapport with young men, with children, that makes them more open to learning math and science and physics.
Absolutely, because they get to see you outside of the classroom setting. So they see
Mhm.
you more as a human being, and you have it's another level of relationship. I could be a little more, how would I say, professional in the class setting, but if we're in a gym, it's another a rapport, which will translate into the classroom as well. But not only to those that I've coached, but to the students of the school. When they see teachers, I gotta tell you, it's very easy to become to get along with teenagers. You give them a little bit of the time, or you buy them a pizza every now and then and it's done. So the door, the trust is the foundation for trust is laid, and then the work begins.
The Quebec Board of Black Educators, when did you get involved?
I got involved as soon as I became a teacher. As
Really?
soon as I got my teaching certificate, and I went in because I knew they existed through the various programs, and I went and I asked them. And actually, I remember I coming. There was a group of older men sitting around the table, and I asked them if they needed a teacher. And I remember the next question was, "Well, can you teach physics?" And then I said, as a matter of fact, I can. And I remember they all looked at each other. But it was years later that they told me that very day they were together because they had just buried a colleague of theirs who used to teach physics. And
Wow.
then they were asking themselves, when are we gonna get someone to teach physics? And then here I walked in. But again, it's that's when you look at these things in retrospect, because I didn't know of it then. I was told about this, years later. And I said, really? So no wonder you guys had such a sort of like he's the future. He's gonna be the next generation of president of the Black educators. But I didn't know it at the time. But like I said, when you look back at a life in education, you realize that the road led to this moment and this position right now.
Did you take to math and physics early on, or did a love of did that love develop later?
Oh no, math was always easy. My dad is a whiz at math. He was
Yeah.
always, and so it out of all the children, it just came natural to me. And I have to tell you, part of my passion in teaching math, because I always tell the students, I always make jokes, for those that may be a little bit more religiously inclined, and I say, listen, don't believe math is the language of God. And what I tell them, I go, no, math is the language of love. And then so I came and said, don't mind whatever it told you. Everything is mathematics, okay? So, and they like that. And some of my students have said, Mr. Adrian, you're a great science teacher, but we love it when you teach math. And I say, why is that? He goes, because when you teach math, you're passionate. You're like a little child and becomes contagious. So I love the concept of mathematics. And I tell people mathematics, in my opinion, is the highest level of reflection when you can express a whole set of ideas into its most simplest expression. So I try to emulate that in other aspects of my life as well.
I want to come back to that because one of our earlier podcasts we talk about financial literacy, and I said on that episode that I don't know anything about money, even now. And I
Mhm.
also, I hated math as a kid, and I think that, that was to my detriment. Um, but luckily, and I know this is something that you're not crazy about. Luckily, we have calculators now and stuff like that. But we're going to come back to that. I want to focus a little bit more on the QBBE.
Mhm.
Um, um, what I find fascinating about the organization, especially in its early days, is how um, um, one of the concepts that they kind of drew into its mission, at least in the early days, was the fact of cultural difference and how it played a role in how kids in immigrant communities learn, and maybe how teachers need to think more clearly about how they teach who they're teaching. If what I'm saying makes any sense. Um, has that changed or morphed over the years?
It has morphed in the sense that the old, I guess, immigration wave has sort of shifted. It has shifted not so much from West Indian countries like Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Haiti, and not to more now. We see a lot more African coming into the country, and however, just like the first immigrants that came in, a lot of them come to this country, but they've already been to university and have university degrees.
Okay.
So that's the similarity that we see. Where it has shifted initially, as I understand it, it was created to help broaden the base for a greater amount of people to have access to the new form a CJEP network that was
Mhm.
formed in the late 80s. And that partnership came to be because they needed to have more people have access to graduation. And there was a observation from the West Indians that came in that there wasn't a lot of blacks doing post-secondary education. But today it has morphed into a program where in our summer school program that the Costa Hall Summer School, which is the flagship program of the organization, that we teach at Dawson College every summer, our population is very diverse. Half of the kids come from all communities. What happened is most of the students who attend schools in the western part of the English Montreal School Board don't want to send their kids all the way to the East End for summer school. So they trust that the service we've been doing is we have proven to be, I guess, efficient over time, and so we get a lot of students from all ethnies and all groups.
Is it still the case that, or have we gotten better at taking into account the different, uh, the diversity and the different ethnic differences? And the reason I'm asking is I'm thinking about, I wonder if it was in the 80s or maybe even the 70s when immigrant communities would, when it came to things like IQ tests and psychological aptitude tests, they would say, well, of course we're not faring very well in these tests. None of these questions are in our wheelhouse. It was very much the dominant culture, I should have the white culture, that didn't take into account other cultures.
It's gotten a little better, I must say, because once you evolve in a diverse milieu, you are confronted with other cultures, you are confronted with other ways of seeing things. So eventually, I think it permeates into the fabric then, but much more so, I guess, in the urban centers than you would find it in the regions. However, this being said, I do think there's much work that needs to be done in integrating that into the curriculum in a more efficient way. It's important that a yes, and to I always say, to the spoil to the victor the spoils of war.
Yeah.
So basically, yes, when you come into a culture, it's Western culture, Western civilization. It's obvious that you're going to be confronted or you're going to be exposed to certain theories, and that's understandable. However, it's the part for let's talk about Black History Month since it just happened. It's the omission of the contributions of people of color or even of the indigenous peoples to the makeup of Canada, as it were, or even for the United States. This is the part I think is lagging behind where we haven't integrated enough. And to that point, I will always say I don't think it's the responsibility of a dominant culture to do that teaching. I think it comes to us, but we have to be or contribution because it's always a good idea to hear from our perspective. But I think it's to allow that to be included in the curriculum. It's to have a conversations with people from our as we form the curriculum. We don't expect to only have our vision. I think the world is such a complex a theater where you need different perspectives. And I think the more perspective you have, the closer it gets to a understanding the concept that we're studying. So I feel that in spite of the work that has been done by Dorothy Williams with the ABCs of history, I don't see there's a movement to integrate it at a I guess, at an official level, either from the ministry. It's more by small initiatives where teachers are aware of it. And there's some wonderful stories in the making of Canada that Black people have contributed to that would be beneficial to the overall understanding. And that may ease that perception of especially other minorities that Blacks haven't contributed anything to society. And that mindset is pervasive, and I think it does create a problem to have an openness. I never liked the concept of tolerance because tolerance says that I have to put up with you, but I don't really need to like you.
Hmm.
And but I think when we coexist, when we share, then we realize that we have much more in common, and it's ultimately I think it's our humanity that brings us together.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And one would hope that the community we live in and learn in would agree. But I suppose what we're talking about is even now in 2025, there is still some exclusion that needs to be examined, needs to be looked at.
Let me give you an example in case. I mean, in some schools, there are still teaching the classics of To Kill a Mockingbird. And yes, great, but there's so much more that have been done that could also probably do the same if you wanted to study the human relationship that was in the story. There's that could be a little more inclusive in nature, and then maybe a little more current, as
Hmm.
opposed to having. I think it's a great opportunity to have to include in the reading list some of the great artists. I myself is still involved in reading some from African authors. Like I know Chimamanda, who was Under the Yellow Sun. I always wanted to know as a young man. I used to hear about the wars, the civil war in Biafra, and
Hmm.
I, where is Biafra? But then I got to understand that it was part of Nigeria, and when the Belgians left and the whole thing. So I think it's a great through literature, and that's why. I have a bachelor's of mathematics, but I have a BA because to me it was important to have both in my formation. I guess in my education, I always wanted to have that artsy type of approach because I don't see the world entirely through numbers. numbers does have its appeal, but I think there's some wonderful plays, there's some wonderful short story that talk about the human condition that can be presented into school settings to broaden people's horizon. I've always felt reading is the cheapest way to travel, and I think especially in these days, we need to travel a little more.
Yeah. You say you have a BA in literature?
No, just a Bachelor of Arts, but
Okay.
concentration in mathematics.
Okay, I understand. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I was listening to a radio show just this week, in fact, about book banning
Oh,
and the idea that there are those who want to ban books because they don't like the material, but there's also the sense that there are so many books that it's impossible to teach them all, even when it comes to the classics. So you talk about To Kill a Mockingbird. The question is, yeah, it's a classic, but do we just sort of put it in the library and get something a little more current? Um, do we read Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, or do we put that aside and bring in something from the 90s, etc.? What's your
exactly.
feeling on that?
Well, I think ultimately we can't get rid of what we consider to be the classics because I think it's part of the overall education. I remember, for example, Death of a Salesman. I
Mm.
read that in high school. I read that in CJEP, and I read that in university again in one of the courses. So this is where I think there's room to Death of a Salesman was a something that I guess was part of the curriculum as such, but to have read it on 3 occasions, well, I didn't have to read it in university because I had read it twice already. But
Mhm.
that's an example of I think there's so much more that can be done at that level to broaden the cultural range and the different authors and perspectives. I think ultimately that's that's what a civilization does. It absorbs whatever is of value or talent, and then you expose it. And I think ultimately that's what changes people. The change is slow, but when you expose through different ways of seeing, when you're looking at the world through a different lens, and then you get to appreciate a little more. You get to see certain nuances that you would not see before. So I think that's where expanding literature. I don't think the kids of today read enough, personally.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I think you're right about that. I know that when my younger brother got into high school, in order to get the kids into reading, they would ask the kids, "Well, what do you want to read?" And here we are. You're right. In 2025, not enough kids are reading, but for those who do, kids in the Black community, what do they want to read? Or is that an
Okay.
unfair question?
Well, it depends on the students. A lot of them, those that love to read, they always have a book in their hand, and you see them. They come to the center. I've inherited from a lot of Afrocentric literature, mostly
Hmm.
to do about the African, the Black, the West Indian condition. We've inherited it from Dr. Clarence Bain, who passed last December. And there's so many, but we are trying to look for ways to get the kids to come in. And I remember one of the books, I was going through a shelf and I saw a book by Eldridge Cleaver, was one of the Black Panther. It was Soul on Ice.
Hmm.
And then so I grabbed the book and then I told the kid, "Do you guys know about Eldridge Cleaver?" And then they said, "No." I expected that. And I said, "Do you know anything about the Black Panther Party?" And then they have no clue. And then it's amazing on how with so much information at their disposal, but yet they know so very little. And I always argue with them. They live in a virtual world that I'm not quite comfortable in, and
Hmm.
and I don't know about this information. But those are the things that concerns me. I see it. I see its direct impact on the reading comprehension. When you give them a problem, to me the statement is clear. Yet they have difficulty to and I think that's one of probably one of the biggest problems that we'll be confronting with our children is the lack of reading comprehension. Because I think they're accustomed to that medium through that cell phone, which is very much graphics, a sound, and it's also small, sort of it's short span.
Hmm.
And I think it has. I've noticed it. I've always worked in both teaching physics, I teach enriched students, but I also would always work in a remedial setting. And that's how I joined the QBBE because I love the fact that to be able to see kids thank you for to go, sir, I never thought I could pass this course. I want to thank you. Now that they're able to graduate, they have a whole life ahead of them. So there's something very gratifying in it. But even I struggle now to get them through the hump
Yeah.
because I find, especially when it comes to the memory, my father always said when he first came to this country that he loves the new approach because in Haiti, where the French system was a lot of you have to learn things by heart. C'était du par cœur.
Hmm.
Well, but he always say that, yes, but memory is a faculty of intelligence. We must always work it. We must always practice it. And I think that's something that today's schools are not doing enough. Yes, it's true that they have the capacity, but the mind still to be able to retain some basic information. And I feel like every morning they get up, they reset the memory to
Yeah.
blank, and then here we go again.
And it's the attention span as well.
Yeah, yeah. The
What would
attention.
you say? Because and I guess we're running out of time, but what would you say is, let's say, the three biggest challenges that the youth today face in terms of learning?
Well, I think primarily is that for in many cases we are using the means of yesterday to teach today the generation of tomorrow. So I think they have transitioned more or less to a sort of a hybrid world, virtual, and a lot of I don't think a lot of teachers or maybe some of the older teachers haven't transitioned to it. I think also the lack of basic numeracy understanding. I find there is I would always to have a joke, for example, if you go into a store and then the fee is something is $17. And then you will you give them a $20 and you give them a two because you don't want the $3 coin, you want the $2, you want the $5 paper in return. And they would be totally confused.
Yeah.
Well, why are you giving me 22? It's only seven. But I
So,
mean that's just an example, but in a real practical way, I find most of the kids today do not have that understanding of numbers, the numeracy, the mental math that I think is so important in developing cognitive scheme and able to people to understand concepts that are a little more abstract. I think that's a major challenge. And then the third one, I have to say, as an educator,
yes.
this has done damage to our children. The focus, their attention span. As a school principal, I used to walk the hallways after lunch and watch as the teacher is teaching to the door, and then the students have the phone and they're texting each other, and that's been a major to me challenge to learning
Yeah,
in
I couldn't agree more. I think part of the problem, I don't know if you agree, is that the younger generation of parents who are in their 20s now grew up with phones, and it's not uncommon to see, a parent pushing a stroller with one hand with the phone in the other.
exactly.
Yeah. So
and
yeah,
and and, and the kid that's all they see, and it's hard it's hard to be in competition as a teacher with those screens if you're not the kind of teacher that can engage him and make him laugh. And I was lucky in that way. I can entertain. I used to always let him know. So he goes, you know why I'm a teacher? Because I have an audience that can't get up and walk. So you're gonna have to suffer my sucky jokes. But if you want a good mark, you need to clap. And so if I say a joke and then I said, excuse me, did you guys get the memo? And he clap. But those little things allow you to create sort of a fun ambiance to learn. But I think those are the challenges that I think today. I don't think they don't have a sense of numeracy. I don't think they read enough. And those cell phones, oof,
so to
is
respond to those challenges, should a young teacher who's embarking on his or her career now come to you and say, I'm about to become a teacher, what advice do you have for me? What would you say?
Look, don't get me wrong, the technology has its place. It has broadened our reach in terms of differentiating. Students learn different ways. Some of them are more visual, some of them are more tactile, and some are more auditory. So when you have the technology at hand, I love the, don't get me wrong, I couldn't teach without a smartboard in my class because
Mhm.
sometimes I used to have to, as a physics teacher, I would leave and come back and demonstrate stuff. No, I don't
Right.
have to do that. I go on YouTube and then I search and then we can see it. So it's also a fun time to teach with the technology. But I think at the root, at the elementary level, they should concentrate on the fundamentals. There's a lot of school like uh, I think the World Waldorf schools. I forget the
Yeah.
name. It's out of Germany. Like kids do not touch technology until they're like 14 years old. They develop those basic human skills, interactions, and tactile. I think we need to go back to a little bit. Too many times do I see people give cell phones to kids as the babysitter. That's the new babysitter now. Here's the
Yes.
phone, and it becomes very difficult for a teacher to compete with that kind of visual effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right about that. Um, and yet, we're constantly debating the issue of cell phones in schools, with many parents getting very indignant. What do you mean my kid can't have his phone?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's a big problem. I think in France they've managed to ban cell phones from from schools altogether. I think we will need to go there, not because we've tried the other way by allowing them, and in many cases it's almost an addiction.
It very much is. Absolutely. I'm guilty of it. I have
Yeah.
to admit.
I
Yeah.
mean, look, we I the first time I was hesitant to have a cell phone, but now that I have it, I can't live without it.
Right?
But the idea that a parent would tell you, and then I hear it all the time, well, how am I going to reach my son? He goes, well, how did my mother reach me when I was in school? We didn't have a cell phone. You call the school.
Yeah. Or you
You
get
call
home
the
and then
school,
you
you leave
call your
a message.
mom.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right.
But
So rein in the technology, numeracy, and literacy.
yes, I think at the elementary level, we need to do better to go back to I guess some fundamentals. I don't know if and don't get me wrong, there's some wonderful work that has been done in the schools. I've seen teachers; they're the hardest working teachers. Those that teach kindergarten and grade 1 and 2, as the children are getting more or less socialized and but I think it's much more than just what the school is doing. It's what society has exposed children to, and like to your point, what the parents also are guilty of in terms of turn down the screen, don't let them watch so much television, have them read a book, and
Yeah.
I think we need to go back to that because it's proven if the student that is a reader does better in school, they do better in school because it's not as challenging, it seems, to understand things and to make it through.
Amen to that. I wish we had more time because there are so many other things I would love to talk about with you. Alix,
Well, listen, since we're going to celebrate Black History Month for the whole year, then you can have me at another time. I'd be happy
you
to come.
got it. You got it. We'll have to just make up an excuse.
Exactly.
Let's get Alix on the podcast. Alix
Eh,
Adrien, it's I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks so much for doing this.
Likewise, Dan. Thank you for having me, and have a
And
blessed
And to you. And thank you for tuning in today. Make sure you download, listen, and share. You can find us on Spotify or at literacyquebec.com. And if you need assistance and support with tasks that require reading, writing, and or digital literacy skills, call the free literacy helpline at 1-888-521-8181. That's 1-888-521-8181. I'm Dan Laxer. See you next time on What's Literacy?